Thank you. Welcome back. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce our plenary speaker, Miriam Bodian, who is professor at University of Texas, Austin. Her work is known to many of us who work in these fields as being representative of the best kind of work on conversos after 1492. Her book, Dying in the Law of Moses, and that was really, for me, was memorable as a student. I remember reading it and saying, I want to write a book like this someday. Hebrews of the Portuguese Nation as well, and many other publications. And so it's a pleasure to be able to introduce her as our speaker, also because I think that she will be able to articulate something that's been in the minds of all of the fellows during the whole fellowship year. Exactly what is the question of continuity? This notion of Sephardiness from past to present, how does it not only affect the relationship between historical periods? How do we write about the medieval or the early modern periods as the same or different or continuous? But how then do we make sense of it in the context of modern discussions of Sephardi identity? This fellowship year began actually years ago when we first thought of it as something that was going to span medieval to the present, which is good that we didn't try to do that. That would have been too much to take in. But I think that the question of the relevance of the present is still with us. And we have to ask what modern discussions or modern references to Sephardic identity today owe to these medieval and early modern discussions and what they don't owe, and where there might be continuities and where breaks. And I think Miriam is the ideal person to lead us through these connections and map out the relationship between modern invocations of Sephardiness and medieval and early modern ones. And more than anyone, I think, in the room has her finger precisely, except maybe you two are tied, Jonathan. I won't put you against each other. You're in good company. Exactly what the relationship between the early modern notion of the nation, the Hebrew nation, and the medieval notions of specialness, exceptionalism, Sephardi identity in all of its myriad forms, what exactly that is and where the break might be. So it's a pleasure. Please join me in welcoming Miriam Bodian for today's lecture.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for that generous introduction and for the invitation. I want to thank Jeff Eidlinger as well, and Kelsey for her work in logistics. It's great to be back. I was a fellow at the Frankel Institute in 2011 and 2012. I have fond memories, and it's a privilege to be here. Today's sessions have made me aware of just how much I have missed over the last 7 months. I wish I'd heard the papers I've heard this morning before I wrote my paper. On the other hand, I'm glad that there's so many points of intersection, and I think they will be obvious to you as I go. I've enormously enjoyed hearing the analyses of Sephardi identity by this impressive gathering of scholars, and I hope this will sort of project somewhat beyond the boundaries of the group, the topics discussed by this group this year. Let me clarify from the start that in this talk I won't be asking whether the Sephardi diaspora was imagined in the sense that Benedict Anderson had in mind when he wrote Imagined Communities. That is, I'm not suggesting that it was a construction of the Sephardim in reference to themselves, something it takes a scholar to see. My premise is that among other scholars, in fact, scholars like me, have been doing the imagining. Oh dear. Okay. A phrase that has been mentioned today, when Maimonides, living in North Africa in the 12th century, referred to himself as Moshe ben Maimon HaSfaradi, what he meant would have been clear to his readers. He, or perhaps his father, but he was quite literally a person from Spain, a land from which he and his family had been driven when he was a boy. It's true that Sephardi had also come to connote a certain intellectual lineage, and this has also been mentioned today, a legal tradition, one deeply influenced by the Spanish Jews' deep entanglement with high Andalusian civilization. But either way, Maimonides' use of the term meant he was directly linked to Spanish soil. During the period from 1391 leading up to and culminating in the expulsion of 1492, tens of thousands of Spanish Jews, if not 100,000 or more, either were scattered throughout the Mediterranean or crossed the border into Portugal. Even with the forced baptism of Portugal's Jews in 1497, there remained in Spain and Portugal a population of men and women who regarded themselves as Jews despite having been baptized. However, it was only by fleeing the peninsula and joining Jewish communities elsewhere that some of them, or their descendants, rejoined the Jewish world. Practically speaking, from 1497 onward, the category of Sephardi could refer only to Jews residing outside the Iberian Peninsula. To my knowledge, no scholar has undertaken the daunting task of examining the vicissitudes of the term Sephardi over time and space. But given the research that exists, it's not at all clear that that term, or any equally sweeping equivalent, was ever meaningful as a term identifying Iberian Jewish emigres and their descendants. Yet the assumption that a Sephardi diaspora has existed for centuries and continues to exist persists both in scholarship and in popular discourse. To be sure, there's an abundance of scholarship today, the findings of which might serve to challenge generalizations about the Sephardim, and I think we heard some about the pre-1492 period today. But there seems little willingness to thoroughly explore the overall problem. I'm neither equipped nor able in this brief talk to offer a comprehensive discussion of it. My aim is to be suggestive rather than exhaustive, applying a broad brush rather than aiming at high resolution. While we may assume that all forms of identity are constructed, they're certainly not all constructed alike. Diaspora identities are particularly unstable and their structure is strikingly variable. One of the most common errors concerning the Sephardim is envisioning this population as the yin of the Ashkenazi yang. To give but one example, this is from a blogger who today speaks confidently of the primordial split between European Jews, Ashkenazim, and Jews of the Arab Muslim world, Sephardim. This is a common and distressingly inaccurate view. It seems to answer a fundamental human need for binaries to assume that there exists a kind of conceptual equivalence between the two, a fundamental symmetry, and that the Christian North and the Islamic Mediterranean define the difference between them. Let's step back for a moment and take a look at the structure of the diaspora of the medieval Franco-German Jews and their descendants on the one hand, and the diaspora of the medieval Iberian Jews and their descendants on the other. This is a rather crude map, but I think it does what's needed here. Between the 9th century and the late 13th century, the Ashkenazim spread from their original places of settlement in the Rhineland westward into England and France, and eastward as far as Prague and Vienna. In the late medieval period, they were expelled from England and France, but their center of gravity remained Central Europe, the primordial Ashkenazi homeland. In the early modern period, a mass migration began into Poland and Lithuania, yet connections with Ashkenazim in Central Europe remained robust, and the Ashkenazim as a whole continued to be concentrated in the relatively compact space of Central and Eastern Europe as far as the Russian border. Within this space, they were virtually the only Jews. While dialects might differ, their common vernacular language was Yiddish. The constant movement of books, merchants, and rabbis between the various Ashkenazi communities and the many internal migrations gave these Jews a remarkably common culture, despite inevitable variations. Vivid testimony to the cohesion of an Ashkenazi world that transcended political boundaries can be found in the memoirs that I'm sure you're familiar with of Gugel of Hameln, On the cusp of modernity, Gluckel described a social world that was inhabited entirely by Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews, a world that extended to Poland, where young men in her orbit were sent to study Talmud, to Metz in Alsace, where Gluckel settled with her second husband. It would not have occurred to her to think of this world as Ashkenazi. It was simply the Jewish world as she knew it. It was us, as is evident when she singles out as Portuguese or Sephardi the few Portuguese Jews she encountered. I don't want to overstate the unity of this world. Ashkenaz was usually used in rabbinic literature in its simple geographical sense, meaning German or Franco-German lands. Certainly differences between German, Polish, Hungarian, and Bohemian Jewries were recognized, but demographically and culturally, the population of Jews in this orbit was deeply interconnected. When Moses Isserlis of Krakow claimed that Polish Jews were descendants of, quote, the Tosafists and the sages of France, he may have been seeking to establish rabbinic yichus, but he was also expressing a genuine sense of spiritual and cultural kinship that bound together Northern European Jews. It was mostly when Ashkenazim left this orbit and settled among other Jewish populations in the Mediterranean, primarily in Italy and the Ottoman Empire, that a need was felt to define a sub-identity. Yet there was no consensus about how that should be done. In some communities, German, Polish, Hungarian, or Bohemian congregations, separate congregations existed side by side, as in Sfat, where there were Hungarian and German congregations, and even for a while in Krakow, where there were Polish and Bohemian congregations. In other communities, all the Yiddish-speaking Jews formed a single congregation. In any case, the Mediterranean situation was irrelevant for the great mass of Central and Eastern European Jews. It was only in the late 18th century that serious fissures began to appear among the Jews in the Ashkenazi heartland, as urban, aspiring Central European Jews abandoned Yiddish for proper German and otherwise strove to be more like their non-Jewish neighbors. The large-scale physical fracturing of the Ashkenazi world began only in the second half of the 19th century, with the massive voluntary displacement of both German and Eastern European Ashkenazim, who resettled primarily in the United States, but elsewhere as well. The dispersion of Ashkenazi Jewry reached a new and tragic level, of course, from 1933 to the post-war period. Post-expulsion Iberian Jewry stands in strong contrast. In the medieval period, Jews in the Iberian Peninsula may not have had developed a consistent Iberian Jewish culture, but they lived in a compact space they referred to as Al-Andalus or Sfarad. Despite an often volatile religio-political environment, the ongoing movement of texts and people between Iberian Jewish centers created a degree of cohesion. From 1391 to 1497, Iberian Jews experienced a series of devastating events, including mass conversion, inquisitorial persecution, and expulsion. The sudden large-scale expulsion of Spain's Jews left many of the exiles moving about the Mediterranean for years, seeking refuge where they could find it in a wide geographical orbit whose cultures, all of them unfamiliar to the exiles, varied markedly. In contrast to Ashkenazi Jews, who despite expulsions and expansion eastward continued to live in the Franco-German lands of their original settlement, the Iberian exiles were entirely uprooted from their homeland, or what they regarded, many of them regarded as their homeland. No less important, other Jewish populations were already present almost everywhere where they resettled. Romaniot Jews, Provençal Jews, and Ashkenazim in Ottoman lands, Italianim and Ashkenazim in Italy, Maghrebi Jews in North Africa, and Mustarabim in the Middle East. Despite scholars' awareness of the diversity of the Jewish Mediterranean, they've often resorted to language that implies the emergence after 1492 of a Sephardi diaspora that remained a more or less stable entity over centuries. In part, this is because the concept of a Sephardi diaspora offers a convenient umbrella for a set of understudied Jewish populations. A version of the West and all the rest is currently being purged from the American college curriculum. But even for those of us who use it, the term Sephardi, like the term Western Civ, is no longer compelling in the way it once was. No one today, for example, would accept the conclusion of H. J. Simmels, who in his classic work Ashkenazim and Sephardim from 1976 relying entirely on the rulings of a rabbinic elite, argued that the Shulchan Aruch served to establish unity among the Sephardim. In his words, quote, "It was only through Yosef Karo and Moses Isserles that the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim became united among themselves." It's not obvious, however, that just because Sephardi is a problematic category, we should do away with it and fundamentally rethink our way of representing the early modern and modern Jewish past. Let me first address the assumptions behind our continuing use of the term. Using the term Sephardim for the population of Iberian exiles and their descendants, as well as for the pre-existing Jewish populations they're said to have simply absorbed, implies that the members of this population were heirs to the great medieval Spanish Jewish legacy, one that they perpetuated, albeit with significant adaptations. This legacy included rabbinic traditions, popular musical traditions, a posture of social and cultural superiority, the use of Iberian vernacular languages, a taste for poetry, and so on. Works like Richard Barnett's edited volume, The Sephardi Heritage, from 1971, which incidentally was supported by the World Sephardi Federation, a force in its own right in the process of identity creation, and Meir Bernardotte's Hispanic Culture and the Character of Sephardic Jews from 1982 served to promote the idea of a culturally distinct Sephardi diaspora. With a somewhat different emphasis, some scholars have focused not so much on the exiles' cultivation of a common cultural legacy as on their consciousness of a common fate. The literature of the educated post-expulsion elite was permeated with expressions of trauma, loss, and despondency. In the wake of the Holocaust, scholars of Jewish history, among them Yitzhak Ber, Chaim Hillel Ben Sasson, Gershom Scholem, and Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, stressed this aspect of Sephardi experience as they examined both expressions of despair and newly aroused messianic longings. Joseph Hacker noted that the awareness of this experience could take an identitarian dimension. Rabbi Yosef Garçon, a Portuguese exile of Castilian origin, addressed his audience as "we, the exiled Jews," Anu Hayudim HaMegorashim. Yet the suffering was not necessarily experienced as a bond between Sephardim. Authors of the period of exile like Shlomo Ibn Verga, Yosef HaKohen, and Samuel Ushke emphatically identified the sufferings of the exiles with Jewish suffering over the centuries. In any case, such memories of persecution and expulsion, however wrenching, naturally faded with time and ceased to be an anchor of identity. To be sure, the exiles from Spain, like most immigrants, tried to reconstruct on new soil the contours and structures of the life they had left behind. But the trajectory that effort took and the length of time it could be sustained depended on diverse factors. Among them were the density and numbers of the Iberian émigrés in the locales and regions where they settled, the density and numbers of other pre-existing Jewish populations in those same places, the power, economic, political, and cultural of the émigrés vis-a-vis these other Jews, the factors favoring or discouraging assimilation of the exiles into the social and cultural world of these other Jews, the conditions of life, urban or rural, coastal or interior, etc., in places of settlement, the impact of the majority society, and so on. So let me zoom in a little at this point. If there was one Mediterranean region where we might say that a relatively uniform Sephardi culture developed, it was in the Ottoman Empire. This was not, however, evident in the settlement patterns of the exiles and their immediate descendants. The early exiles clung strongly to identities based on local origins, establishing multiple congregations in the towns where they settled with names like Cajal Catalan, Saragossa, Aragon, Évora, Mallorca, etc. One of the major rabbinic scholars of his day, David Ben Zimra, otherwise known as the Radbaz, a Spanish exile who lived in Sfat, Fez, and Cairo, saw this maintenance of local identity among the exiles and other Jewish émigrés as normative. He wrote that, quote, "It is a custom wherever Jews live that Jews who are of the same city of origin and language make a community for themselves and do not mix with men of a different city and language. For hearts are divided according to the divisions of places and languages. Ki bechiluk hamekomot ve'eleshonot yitchalku halevavot." And to me, this is a statement about identity. We should not mix the communities, he continues, we should not mix the communities or establish new rules. Likewise, the rabbinic scholar Yosef Ibn Lev wrote in the same period that, quote, in Salonika, every Jew speaks his own native tongue. When the exiles arrived, each language group founded an independent congregation, and there is no movement from one congregation to another. Each congregation appears to function as an independent city. Elsewhere as well, language was used as the criterion for determining belonging, thus dividing up the exiles according to whether they spoke Catalan, Aragonese, Castilian, or Portuguese. A dispute arose in Sfat in 1562 around this principle of organization, and it's, I think, quite revealing. The controversy arose over a communal regulation issued that year, which held that, quote, whoever comes to this city, that is Sfat, if both he and his father were born in Italy, even though his grandfather came from Portugal or Castile or Aragon or some other kingdom, he should join the Kahal Italia. Members of the Kahal Aragon naturally objected to this regulation, arguing that it was unjust that someone known to be Aragonese, Yadua Shehu Aragonese, should be required to join the Italian congregation just because he and his father were born in Italy. The rabbinic scholar Moshe Trani agreed with them in a responsum in which he asserted one's primary language as the determinant of identity. Right. Whoever comes from Italy, even though he and his father were born there, if his father's family came from the kingdom of Aragon, so named on account of the Aragonese language, Nikra Milashon Aragon, he should belong to the Aragonese congregation, according to the custom that everyone should belong to the congregation of those people who speak his language and not another one. Of course, this debate should not be understood simply as an argument over identity. It was also an argument over resources, as Moshe Trani made clear, since the Aragonese community stood to lose financial support as it lost members. But this responsum is instructive because an expansive Sephardi consciousness played no role in the debate. And of course, neither of these ways of defining belonging by one's grandfather's place of birth or by one's language had the potential to establish a long-term ethnic identity based on ancestral origins. While the reality was no doubt a good deal messier than the names of the various congregations convey, this pixelated pattern of communal organization nevertheless throws into question any notion that the Iberian exiles came with or began to form a Sephardi identity. It appears that only in places where there were too few Jews to form separate congregations did single mixed congregations develop, but such congregations might include other non-Iberian Jews as well. Although the tendency of these communities to fragment and to continue fragmenting over the decades persisted in the Ottoman Empire, scholars have nevertheless argued that over time, as a result of various factors, among them the overbearing behavior of the Iberian exiles toward the Romaniyat and Mustarab communities, intermarriage, linguistic mixing, and the creation of interlocking social and commercial networks, a common Sephardi cultural style came to prevail. As Joseph Hacker put it, quote, gradually, systematically, the pluralism of customs engendered by the separate organization and differing origin of the various communities of the empire evolved into Sephardi Castilian usage. Of course, the important trend Hacker pointed to, he called it Sephardization, was one that he observed only for the central regions of the Ottoman Empire, that is Turkey and the Balkans. He did not suggest that it reflected developments throughout the Mediterranean lands where exiles settled. Jane Gerber, in her Jews of Spain, made a similar and similarly limited argument. More recently, Jonathan Ray has made a bolder argument. The exiles, he maintains, could not have brought with them a coherent medieval Iberian Jewish legacy, since such a legacy did not exist. It was only in the wake of the expulsion that something one might call Sephardic Jewry coalesced. Several factors brought this about, in his view. The long-distance commercial and rabbinic networks that would later characterize the Sephardi world in the 17th and 18th centuries were already beginning to form in the 16th. The shared experience of cultural dislocation was one of the factors fostering a new unity. Finally, when the Iberian exiles with their localized identities came into routine contact with Mustarab, Romaniyat, Italian, and other Jews, they became more aware of what they shared with each other. It was in this context, he wrote, that, quote, the outlines of a general Sephardic identity began to emerge. Judeo-Spanish in its various forms looms large in Ray's analysis as the linguistic basis for Sephardi identity. Eventually, the mix of Jewish types in the Mediterranean region, along with the demands of everyday life, made it difficult to retain regional Iberian languages like Aragonese, Catalan, or Portuguese. As a result, in certain areas where Jews of Iberian background were predominant, a process of linguistic adaptation led to the crystallization of a form of Spanish, written in Rashi's Hebrew script, with borrowings from Hebrew, Arabic, Italian, Greek, and Turkish, a language Jews referred to as Ladino, or Español, or Judesmo, or Franco, or Judeo. Judeo-Spanish is actually a 19th century term. By the mid-16th century, Ladino works began to be printed in several Italian and Turkish cities. This is a sitter for women from 1565 in Ladino. We don't know exactly where it was printed. According to an inquisitorial deposition given by a Jew of Iberian origin in Pisa in 1600, quote, not only throughout the Levant, but also in Venice, Ancona, Ferrara, and here in Pisa, end quote, it was common practice for Jews of Iberian background to hire tutors to teach their children to write and read Ladino. Yet it was only in the Ottoman Empire that Ladino emerged as the Jewish vernacular. Indeed, in some Ottoman towns, Ladino was a sufficiently important language that it was picked up by Greek and Arabic-speaking Jews as well, blurring the boundaries between the pre-existing population and the descendants of Iberian emigres. But Ladino was never the language of the broader Sephardi or a broader Sephardi diaspora. In Italy, where the Iberian emigres didn't dominate other Jewish populations as they did in the Balkans, Iberian languages did not survive for long. Even in Italian towns where Iberian emigres predominated, Judeo-Spanish did not survive. In Livorno, for example, which was a community which was overwhelmingly dominated by ex-converso Portuguese Jews, Italian quickly became the language of commerce and everyday life. In the Maghreb, where, as in Italy, the Iberian emigres did not outnumber the pre-existing Jewish population, Iberian languages were soon replaced by Arabic, except in communities in northern Morocco, like Tangier and Tetuan, where a distinctive form of Judeo-Spanish known as Hakatiya survived until the 20th century. It's now pretty much an extinct language, although you can find it online if you want pronunciation. While language may be but one of the factors involved in identity formation, it can be taken to suggest an entire repertoire of shared cultural elements, customs, memories, associations, and foodways, as well as kinship and mercantile relationships. The lack of a common language among descendants of the exiles is, I think, indicative of a more general pattern of overall diversification that throws into question whether there existed a far-flung Sephardi diaspora even in the 16th century. Of course, in Hebrew texts, the terms Sephardi of the time, Sephardi and Sephardim, these terms were used. It's important to be attentive, however, to what they meant. In the aftermath of the expulsion, the term could mean simply Jews from Spain, or perhaps Jews whose minhag was Iberian, that is, one Jewish type among many, without the connotation of members of a single ethnic group that was reconstituting itself in Mediterranean lands. Certainly, we should be careful not to let modern assumptions about the crystallization of a Sephardi diaspora affect the way we read 16th century texts. For example, the traveler Rabbi Moshe Basola, in his travelogue Masaot Eretz Yisrael, wrote of Jerusalem in 1522 that, quote, the community includes all kinds of Jews. There are 15 Ashkenazi householders and many Sephardim, and there are Mustarabim, that is Moriskim, the ancient inhabitants of the land, and Maravim, that is Maghrebim, who came from Berberia. This description identifies the various Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem in terms of their geographical origins, that is, as either emigres or natives. The Sephardim, like the Ashkenazim and Maghrebim, were seen as foreigners, not members of a Sephardi diaspora that included Jerusalem. In North Africa, the Spanish exiles were known as Megurashim, that is, those who were expelled, a term not adopted elsewhere. This term distinguished them from the pre-existing population of Maghrebis, or as they were known after the expulsion, Toshavim. The Megoashim in the Maghreb initially preserved their Iberian languages and distinctive style of dress. But to the dismay of their Iberian-trained rabbis, they were soon adopting customs and beliefs of the Mustarab Jews, including pilgrimages to the sites of Jewish Kedoshim. It seems important to underscore the obvious that the foundational identity of the descendants of these Iberian exiles as Jews allowed them to adopt the folkways and languages of other Jews with whom they came into everyday contact, and to relinquish elements of Iberian Jewish culture that had lost their value or vitality without undue psychic upheaval. This doesn't mean that distinctions among North African Jews ceased. Rather, they developed along different lines. Not surprisingly, in areas where contact with the Iberian Peninsula persisted, as in northern Maghrebi coastal towns that I mentioned, Tangier, Tetuan, Jews continued to identify with the culture of Spain and Portugal, whereas in the Maghrebi hinterland, scholars have documented a blending of the cultures of the Megoashim and the Toshavim. The arrival in the Mediterranean region of conversos fleeing from Spain and Portugal in the 16th century did not in the long run have a major impact on these trends. To be sure, in the short run, the arrival of the new emigres served to reinforce the knowledge and use of Spanish and Portuguese among the descendants of exiles. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese ex-conversos were actively printing Jewish books in these languages in Ferrara, an enterprise that was later transferred to Venice. This is the work I will be speaking about presently. In 1553, Samuel Ushke, a Portuguese converso refugee who settled in Ferrara, published this classic work, Consolation for the Tribulations of Israel, not in Spanish, a language he certainly knew, and the more respected Iberian literary language, but in Portuguese. He had composed the work, he stated, specifically for the benefit of Nossa Nação Portuguesa, our Portuguese nation, a group that he also referred to collectively as the Desterro de Portugal, the Portuguese dispersion. That is, he made a conscious choice to identify with a group whose fate distinguished it from the descendants of the Spanish exiles. From the mid-16th century, conversos fleeing the peninsula shifted their direction of flight from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic with its newly dynamic commercial centers. And here I'm going to redraw the map. Now it becomes very complicated, and you have this, Mediterranean space, but you also have this other space that goes right off the side of the map here. Over the next century, these Jews mapped out what has widely been seen as an extension of the Sephardi diaspora, with key communities in Bayonne, Bordeaux, Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, Recife in Dutch Brazil, Joden Savannah in Suriname, and Newport in the British colonies. The Jews of this diaspora are often referred to as the Western Sephardim. These Jews never referred to themselves as Sephardim or any equivalent. They primarily referred to themselves as Ushke did, as members of the Nação or Nossa Nação or the Nação Portuguesa. This is not to say that the Portuguese Jews of Northern Europe regarded themselves as having no connection to the old Sephardim, I'm going to call them, of the Mediterranean. Initially, as a population of neophyte Jews, they were reliant on the old Sephardim with their rabbinic culture, printed books, and institutional models. Moreover, the Jews in Amsterdam or Bordeaux often had Portuguese Jewish relatives living in Italy, North Africa, or the Ottoman Empire with whom they remained in contact. Some of the northern Portuguese adopted or reclaimed the surnames of elite Sephardi families, Abouab, Benatar, Coronel, Atias, Tsarfati, Abarbanel. They provided a ready audience for such works as Maimonides' Hilchot HaTshuva, Ibn Pakuda's Chovot HaLevavot, and Ibn Verga's Shevet Yehuda, which were printed in Amsterdam and Venice in new Spanish translations. When the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam imported rabbis as part of the general enterprise of community building and re-Judaization, they showed an overwhelming preference for Sephardi rabbis from the Mediterranean region. In certain circumstances, they spoke of themselves as part of a continuous Iberian Jewish diaspora, one they referred to using the awkward construction, Hebrews of the Spanish and Portuguese nation. Overall, however, the Atlantic Portuguese Jews' fashioning of a connection to the Old Sephardim had mainly symbolic and strategic value, conferring on them legitimacy and the appearance of cultural roots that went back to medieval Spain. In fact, they never developed more than superficial connections with the dominant Sephardi populations of the Mediterranean region. The two populations were simply too different. I won't belabor this point, which I've discussed elsewhere, but I'm glad to discuss it. Moving on to the 18th century. It's not an intensively studied period for Mediterranean Jewry, but there seems little to support the notion of a Sephardi collective awareness in that period either. And I think especially revealing is the work of Matthias Lehmann, who has studied the emissaries from Palestine who traveled throughout the Jewish diaspora to collect funds for the Jewish poor in the communities of Eretz Israel, and his examination of the policies for distributing those funds. The travel diaries of emissaries like Moshe Chagiz and Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the Chida, vividly expose the fault lines separating Sephardi populations in this period. In his Sfat Emet, published in Amsterdam in 1707, Moshe Chagiz complained that the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, Livorno, and Venice sent contributions, quote, only for those individual poor who belong to the category of Sephardim, shehem tachat sug shem Sephardim, by which he meant Portuguese Jews. He praised the Ottoman Jews for giving money to emissaries of any background, quote, whether Levantine, Sephardi, meaning Portuguese, Ashkenazi, or Polish. So his categories are of interest here because he uses the term Sephardi only to refer to Portuguese Jews, and Levantine as the term for Ottoman Jews. Still more revealing are the reactions of the Chida to the different groups of non-Ashkenazi Jews he encountered in Italy, Tunisia, southwest France, and Amsterdam in the 1750s and 1770s. In contrast to the Europeanized Portuguese Jews of Livorno, Azulai explicitly identified himself as a Levantino. In his extended visit to Tunis, he observed the tensions between the Grana, or the Italian-speaking Portuguese Jews from Livorno, whom he identified as Legoneses, and the Tuansa, the community comprised of Maghrebi Jews and descendants of earlier Iberian emigres. Azulai was hosted by the Tuansa community, and while he spoke glowingly of their dedication to Torah study, he was repelled by their manners, particularly at the table, where fingers were the preferred eating utensil. Lehmann speculates that Azulai was hosted by this community rather than the Livornese because he was visiting from an Islamic land. He was coming from an Islamic land, and according to a communal ruling of 1741, Jewish emigres from Christian lands were required to join the Portuguese Grana community, whereas Jewish emigres from Islamic lands were required to join the Tuansa community. So identity was established on the basis of cultural attributes acquired through the emigres' own lived experience, not on the basis of their, by this time, distant ancestral heritage. Such a ruling seems to foreshadow what in the 19th century was to become the fundamental divide in the Maghreb between Jews who were oriented culturally to European colonial powers and Jews who remained oriented to local Islamic ways. In any case, Azulai, as a Levantino, identified with neither of the Sephardi communities he encountered in Tunis. Neither did he identify with the Portuguese Jews he met in Amsterdam and southwest France, whose lax observance and heterodox leanings shocked him deeply. Azulai's categories also hint at the disappearance of distinctions among Ottoman Palestine's Jews between those with Iberian ancestors and the native Arabic-speaking Mustarabim, who had been thoroughly assimilated by the 18th century. They were all simply Levantinos, Ottoman subjects for whom the Ottoman lands were home, distinguishing them from Ashkenazim and increasingly from Moroccan Jews who had settled in Ottoman Palestine, but regarded themselves as foreigners with a homeland elsewhere. By the 19th century, if not earlier, it appears that Ottoman Jews had ceased to think of themselves in relation to an Iberian past, even if they spoke Ladino. By the 19th century, however, European powers were exerting influence in the Islamic Mediterranean in a way that was disrupting developing regional patterns. Among Jews, the activity of the Alliance Israélite Universelle which in the 1890s began establishing schools to promote French culture among Jews in the Balkans and the Maghreb, challenged the way some of those Jews thought of themselves. A new Europeanized elite began to form. Yet the great majority of Ottoman Jews resisted the efforts of the Alliance to replace Ladino with French. An Alliance report of 1908 on the Jews of Istanbul stated that, quote, Judeo-Spanish is the preeminent language of the people, and it will remain so for quite some time, whatever we might do. And this here is an issue of a Ladino newspaper, El Tiempo, from 1905. It was a weekly, and here a bar mitzvah invitation in Ladino from a town in Bulgaria, Pajarjic, in 1928. Yet neither the Europeanists nor the traditionalists among the Ottoman Jews identified themselves as Sephardim. It was only with the Ottoman Empire's loss of the Balkans, the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which put new pressure on Jews to learn Turkish, and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire with World War I, that these Jews, having lost the secure anchor of Ottoman subjecthood, began to envision or re-envision themselves as Sephardim. In the Maghreb, or rather in Morocco, which had the largest Jewish population in North Africa, a different dynamic was at play. By the 19th century, a long process that Shlomo Deschen has called melechization, the melechization of Moroccan Jewry, after the forced enclosure of Jews in the melach, or special quarter, had led to considerable ethnic homogenization among Moroccan Jews and an increasing identification of Jews simply with the Jewish population of their own town. Daniel Schroeder has argued that to the degree that some Moroccan Jews did continue to identify with Spain, it was usually with Arab Andalusian Spain, an identification that allowed them to claim a shared cultural heritage with the majority Muslim population where they were, rather than with the Hispano-Christian Spain and the Castilian language that was the basis of Ladino. In small pockets of northern Morocco, however, Jews continued to speak Hakatiya, the Castilian of the Maghreb, as late as the 20th century. With growing Spanish influence in Morocco, beginning with the invasion and occupation of Tetuan in 1860 and the establishment here of a Spanish protectorate in northwestern Morocco in 1912, Hakatiya-speaking Moroccan Jews began to identify with a non-Arab Hispanic past. They had long regarded as inferior the poor Arabic-speaking Jews of the Moroccan interior, whom they called forasteros, or outsiders. The divide now took on a new aspect of advanced European versus backward Arabic, of Occidental versus Oriental. There's some irony that the term Sephardim eventually came to refer to a Jewish population that was regarded as lagging behind European Jews, since from as early as the late 18th century, German Jews looked to medieval Sfarad for cultural, aesthetic, and intellectual models. During the Berlin Haskalah and long afterward, the rationalism of Maimonides, the picturesque beauty of Spanish Moorish architecture, the worldliness of medieval Hebrew poetry, the un-Yiddishized Sephardi pronunciation of Hebrew, all of these gave legitimacy to Judaism as a civilized tradition and struck a chord with German Jews who were anxious to distinguish themselves from bearded, Yiddish-speaking, aesthetically challenged Eastern European Jews. 19th century Orientalism, however, threw into confusion the Maskilic idealization of Islamic Sfarad. An image was emerging in European art and literature of an Oriental world that was exotic, sensual, and aestheticized, but also backward. The Alliance had sprung into action precisely to try to help Jews in Muslim lands to catch up. Thus, what John Ephron has called, quote, the allure of the Sephardic came up against the distressing reality that the densest existing population of Sephardi Jews, those living in Muslim lands, seemed sorely lacking in the qualities associated with the medieval Sephardi elite, even if they spoke a language close to Castilian. Not surprisingly, the paternalistic reformist attitude of the Alliance mutated into the attitude eventually adopted by the Zionist movement, and this despite Theodor Herzl's flaunting of his own Sephardic roots, and his eagerness to have Sephardim in exotic dress parade at the Zionist congresses. The mainstream secular Zionist leadership, with its absolute certitude about the rightness of their political outlook and their self-image, both forged in Central and Eastern Europe, tended to view dismissively a Mediterranean population of Jews for whom that outlook and self-image were alien. This attitude contributed to the widespread use of the term Sephardim as a catch-all term identifying the entire population of non-Ashkenazi Jews in the new state of Israel, with the mass immigration from Muslim states of Jews from Muslim states. The greatest number of these Jews were Moroccan, but the immigrants also included Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Egyptian, Kurdish, Turkish, and even Yemenite Jews, far from homogeneous population. In the late 1970s, momentum grew for a protest movement. I'm going very rapidly through. You're all familiar with this anyway. Momentum grew for a protest movement among these Jews who demanded a place in public life and an end to discrimination. This is a screenshot of a video clip of one of the founders of the Black Panthers in 1971 saying, "Shelo tachshov l'rega she'hamizrachim omdim bator." You shouldn't think for a moment that the Mizrahim are going to stand in line. The experience of these Jews of decades of marginalization and discrimination produced a sense of solidarity that now justified a common identity. The global zeitgeist, with its identity politics of all kinds, was also favorable to such a protest movement. In Israel, the activists insisted on self-identification as Mizrahim, a term that has taken the place of Sephardim in Israeli public discourse. Scholars often use the construction Sephardi and Mizrahi, or Sephardi and Middle Eastern Jews, or Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, to convey the ethnic entanglement of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern Jewish populations. Implicit in the adoption of the term Mizrahim is a rejection of Western fantasizing about the East, an assertion of one's own representation of one's Middle Eastern or North African roots. This shift has been the result of a collective political effort, and it's still reverberating quite palpably in Israeli society. Somewhat discordantly, however, there has also been a revival of Sephardi identity among diaspora Jews with roots in Muslim lands. While this revival takes some of its cues from Mizrahi self-affirmation in Israel, it should be seen in the context not of post-colonial politics, but of modern urban psychic anxieties about personal identity and community. This kind of Sephardism is pursued in a variety of ways in social media, in autobiography, in cookbooks, in film and television. Rather than being a quest for social justice, like identity politics in Israel, it's a quest for personal fulfillment and expression, often with a strong measure of nostalgia. It also has its practical side. It is maximally inclusive, thus whether your roots are Greek, Turkish, Syrian, Bulgarian, Moroccan, Iranian, or Yemenite, you have a place among the Sephardim. And you can go to Sephardic Gen and see just how this amalgamation it's very easy to do it online. Here is a diaspora in cyberspace. It's an effort of imagination and also of commerce. Many of the artists and chefs who are engaged in constructing this new Sephardi culture amalgamate different elements of Balkan, Middle Eastern, and North African Jewish cultures, recognizing diversity while at the same time aiming to express something essentially Sephardi. This is not tonight's performance, but this may give you a taste of tonight. I'm not sure. We'll see. But this is a group that sorry, how do I go back here? Here we go. Ventana's fused passion and intimate dialogue, embracing the varied instrumental and melodic traditions of North Africa, the Balkans, Turkey, and Spain to create fresh interpretations and original songs. Oud, baglama, darbuka, and I hope I'm pronouncing those right, and percussive flamenco footwork intertwined with surprising harmony. So this is clearly a very contemporary creation. Since 2014 and 2015, of course, there's been a new approach to defining what it means to be Sephardi, with the legislation to extend Spanish or Portuguese citizenship to the descendants of Jews who were driven out of these lands. But don't worry, I'm going to resist the temptation to speculate about this and move on to a conclusion. So the question, was there ever something we can legitimately call a Sephardi diaspora in the post-1492 period? To be meaningful in my view, a diaspora must have some degree of social and cultural cohesion. Otherwise, what does it mean? A cohesion that's supported by exchange and contact among its scattered population. To be meaningful over time, a diaspora also needs to preserve and perpetuate aspects of the culture of the place of origin, and perhaps hopes of return to that place. I'm increasingly struck by the way a notion of a Sephardi diaspora has been imposed on a population of men and women who never saw themselves this way, even in the 15th century, much less in later centuries, as the population of descendants of Iberian emigres became ever more differentiated linguistically, culturally, and socially, and as they mixed with other Jewish populations and adopted new forms of identity. There's another factor at work, in addition to those I've enumerated, one that has to do with our working environment as scholars. Recent historical scholarship, echoing our own contemporary awareness of globalization, has placed extraordinary emphasis on early modern networks of connection forged primarily through trade. This has greatly accentuated cosmopolitan, cross-cultural, and diasporic trends. It has correspondingly thrown into shadow the more perhaps prevalent way of life of most early modern people, including Jews, one that unfolded in the home, the neighborhood, the marketplace, the local religious community, amid local power structures and regional landscapes, where new particularistic cultural formations emerged. For Jews with Iberian ancestry, increasing rootedness in these formations made a pan-Sephardic identity difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. There's still a lot to be learned about Jewish life and society in the scattered places where the Iberian exiles settled and continued to move about. But existing research is surely sufficient today to support a more sophisticated approach to describing and analyzing the changing contours of the post-expulsion Jewish world than the one we've inherited and tend to fall back on. With that, I have to say that this presentation doesn't presume to offer such a framework. I'm delighted that Ryan has given us permission not to resolve everything today, and so I'm going to leave it there.
So we have lots of time for questions, and I think maybe the easiest way is to let you field your own.
Okay, fine.
You can pick
Fine,
favorites or
fine.
people.
Let's let those who've had enough leave.
Those who want to can stay.
Todd?
How much of the 20th century sense of there being a Sephardi diaspora is due to ways in which Sephardim themselves in the 19th century, maybe even the late 18th century, created a sense of a Sephardi identity only because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Ashkenazim in their midst. I'm thinking of Amsterdam, I'm thinking of London, and probably elsewhere as well.
Well, you mentioned Amsterdam and London, and I think one of the things that emerges clearly for me is that the Portuguese Jews formed their own little diaspora, and I really don't see them as Western Sephardim. I find it very difficult to think of them as Western Sephardim because they have so little to do with the Mediterranean Sephardi world, the Mediterranean world at all. So,
but they create a myth about it. Particularly
but
in the 19th century.
But they don't regard it as Sephardi. It's Nassau. It's the myth around the Nassau, which is distinctly Portuguese Jewish, not.
I guess I'm thinking of even more watered down versions in the 19th century. But people like Grace Aguilar or even Benjamin Disraeli.
Oh, okay. They're picking up on Orientalism and like Herzl did, in his own way, and fashioning a self. But I think it's very individual with them, but a romanticized sense of self. Yes, I agree. But I think they're picking up on European Orientalism, and that would be a subchapter in a book written on this subject, I would say.
Yeah, I mean they're inventing it.
Yeah. Well, they know they're Sephardim and they're proud of being Sephardim because they're Portuguese Jews, but they are using the contemporary discourse of Orientalism to really create a sense of self that's new and very different from the Ashkenazim, but different from the Ashkenazim in a different way than the Berlin Maskilim were different from the Eastern European Ashkenazim. That is less rationalistic, more sort of colorful, exotic. Is that fair to say? Everybody agrees?
So in a way, it just like to reformulate, I think it's really fascinating because it shakes a little the ground on which the assumptions that even we in our group have fallen back on. The idea that what we're going to call Sephardic is suddenly just Mediterranean. Let's try an experiment, call it just Mediterranean. So the Jews of Spain who end up in Italy, North Africa, and Turkey are the Sephardim. Whereas the others, the Portuguese, who are not really ever Mediterranean, they're not looking Mediterranean, they're looking Atlantic, they're looking north, they're the Nassau, they're the only ones with cohesion. And the ones we're calling Sephardic lack cohesion, lack all the things you're identifying as actually having a diaspora.
I didn't talk about the institutional or organizational, but that's quite right, that the Portuguese in various ways institutionalized in communal organization their distinct identity, and that doesn't happen in the Mediterranean.
And it's only with German nostalgia for something which connects all of these disparate elements and makes them into some hodgepodge. When people start fudging the two into one.
Well, the German really has to do with medieval Iberia, not with the Mediterranean. They do not identify with Moroccan Jews. Yes.
I just want to mention that the focus of our group is quite different, because I think that at least 10 of us in the group from 13 are actually focusing on the pre-exilic period. So for us, the real question is what's going on inside the Iberia during the Muslim period and the Christian, when most of the population of the Jews in the Iberia lived under Muslim rule and then under Christian rule. And how we see continuity between those two phases. And only 2 or 3 of us in the group are actually occupied with question which is related to the period that you are actually spoke about here, presented here. So for us, the question of Sephardim is really the question of still the what's happened during the time that Jews lived in this Sfarad, actually, as Jews.
That's the legitimate concern of the group this year. I think Ryan explained why it was of interest, and I've heard several people say here that we've been talking. Well, you said it also, that we've been talking about Sephardi identity in the pre-1492 period when it really didn't exist, with the implication that it did exist after 1492. So I think this is
We have another.
Sorry, Ross, I didn't mean to speak for you. I speak for everybody else, but not for you.
No, not for others.
I actually had to alter my own paper after hearing this morning's talks, because it's so clear that you can't talk about, that you can talk about a legal tradition and the Andalusian tradition, but you can't really talk about an Iberian Jewish culture in the way that I assumed. So this is an opportunity for us to adjust our assumptions all around. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. So it seems like you're suggesting to think about the Western diaspora, the Western Sephardis, as a different project, which is not part of the Mediterranean one. But if
Mostly not. Mostly not.
But what happens if we look at these different communities as forming a part of a network or networks, right? Because looking at a Sephardi network is also a popular thing now. So, and once you do that, right, it becomes one fabric, and it's hard to disconnect one part from the other. And especially if we look at people, right? Someone like a pirate Palace, right, from the Maghreb, who ends up much to the north, or Yaakov Sasportas, right, who also belong to us. So, and you have Livorno, which is also a bit Portuguese. So once you look at things through like moving people and through networks, it's harder.
Well, one thing I want to emphasize is that networks don't tell us everything about a diaspora. And a network can include, as Francesca Turolato has shown very nicely, that it's not just it's not just Jews who are in these networks. There are all kinds of people in these networks, and her conclusion is that capitalism works. That these were rational merchants, and they made networks according to their interests and not according to their ethnicity. So that's just one aspect of it. But of course, there are family networks that reach across boundaries, and I've studied this for the Portuguese for the 17th century. However, it drops off precipitously in the late 17th century as the Amsterdam community recedes in importance. And in any case, their real focus is not the Mediterranean, it's the Atlantic. That's where they make the big bucks, or not bucks, but some other currency. Yes.
I just,
Maya.
as a medialist, I'd like to make an observation that your argument doesn't surprise me, because even in medieval Spain or medieval Iberia, let's include Portugal in that too, there was no such thing as Sepharad, except in the imagination of the poets and the literary readers.
Well, it was a name for a place.
Yeah, but it was always a very divided place. There was no unity in Spain. Iberia. Portugal had been an independent kingdom since the middle of the 12th century. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the Portuguese Jews, after they were expelled from Portugal, they had a very different identity than the Spanish Jews, who themselves, there was no such thing as a Spanish Jew in any case. There was, even in the 15th century when they were expelled, Spain was a very new creation. I mean, Hispania had existed before, Sepharad existed before, but it's really an idea more than a real thing, even in the Middle Ages.
Okay, but you can also say, and if we look at Ashkenazi Jewry, it also transcends political boundaries and languages and so on. So I don't think that's key. And the other thing I would say is that at least half of the Portuguese population of 1497, at the time of the forced baptisms, scholars think that about half were Jews from Spain who had crossed the border in 1492. We know nothing about any distinctions. Of course, we don't know much about that period at all, but we don't know that there were clear distinctions between the native Portuguese Jews and the exiles who came and joined the communities. It must have been a tremendous feat for these communities to absorb so many immigrants, but there doesn't seem to have been any kind of cultural tension between them. It does seem to have been a pretty continuous cultural space.
Also, they did not speak the same language. Well, not me.
Have you ever been to Galicia? Have you ever been to Galicia?
Yes.
That's Spain, and it just sounds like Portuguese. I mean, you know, Spain is still to this day very regional, and you can hear all kinds of.
Exactly. That's precisely my point.
Yeah.
But I just wouldn't say that there's a Spanish language. Well, there's Castilian, and most of the those who fled Spain for Portugal were from Castile. But those along the border probably spoke something close to Portugal, and certainly those who were near the Portuguese border were the ones who had the most interest in taking that route and not going a great distance to a port where somebody would carry them off across the sea. Ross.
So this is not so much a reaction to your talk, which was, I learned so much from it. This was really inspiring. But to some of what we're hearing in the wake of it, I guess. So we already heard today that there was a developing but distinctive Andalusi Jewish, or we'll call it Sephardi, legal tradition, which endured and which was self-consciously so. Not immediately, but that self-consciousness of it being a distinctive Jewish legal tradition existed. If we survey from beginning in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, the writings of Hebrew grammarians and lexicographers and all of the poets in one way or another, and I grant that it's in very different ways, but to a lesser extent in terms of constructedness, the philosophers, but even there's a bit of it. And you can even, I fold Halevi in rejecting Sfarad, that we reclaim him in his rejection of it. So, you know, all of the lexicographers and the grammarians and the exegetes talking about what Sfarad means, and the one time it appears as a hapax in the Bible, all mean the same thing. And what they mean, and I grant it's completely constructed, and I have no idea whether, if at all, it filters down to people who aren't part of the intellectual and social elite. I don't know that. I have no way of knowing that. But for the elites, this idea was very real. And they propagated it, and they marketed it, and they sold it, and they elevated themselves on the basis of it. And that lasted at least for 250 years. And my view is that whatever questions we might have about what Sephardi, post-Andalusi Sephardis thought or didn't think about themselves or their community or their traditions, none of that would have existed without the Andalusi period. That's the point of origin of all of this. And so we need to always be going back to that. It's not to say that that was not your job today, so I'm fine with that. But the evidence for the earlier period is it's overwhelming that there is a class of intellectuals doing different kinds of intellectual work that want to market this idea. And what I've done is I've traced it. They are attempting to do, and then they depart because there's an asymmetry between minority and majority community. They are trying to do for the Jews of Al-Andalus what they observe the Muslims doing. They are establishing a certain authority, legitimacy, superiority, elitism. This has been observed before, but what I've done is I've gone through all the sources, and when you line them all up together, it's a big deal. It's a project that lasted for several hundred years.
I think
so what I'm really saying is I want Ryan to let me give another talk tomorrow.
I think you're making a good point, and I have to say, I recognize my limitations, and I appreciate this. And no, but I think this is something that the Portuguese Jews do pick up, although they spin it in their own way.
Yes.
But I do think that that's a thread that runs
all
through.
the early modern and then modern and contemporary incarnations are all predicated on this earlier story. They wouldn't exist in the form that they exist without this memory or,
I'm not.
mythic or however you want to call it.
That I'm not sure.
They're predicated on difference. Sometimes the foil is Ashkenaz, sometimes the foil is this. The foil varies, but it's predicated on the idea of difference.
Well, all identity is predicated on the idea of
course,
difference.
of course.
But that particular difference,
And it involves elitism.
what we see, and what?
And it involves elitism.
Well, but
Chauvinism.
what you see in the state of Israel, 1970s onward, is a movement that is an attempt to reassert not superiority, but just equality.
Equality would be a good place to start.
Right, right. I mean, they do not regard themselves as courtiers. The Black Panthers are not, they don't belong to a courtier
That's
class.
a different social political context.
It is. But I do appreciate what you're saying, and I think these things need to be discussed and thought about. As I said, this is not a program. It's an attempt to
And
read.
you were talking about post-1492, and I get that.
Well, but I think this pertains to post 1492. But I don't claim this is definitely a work in progress, and I take that comment to heart. Yes, Hussein.
This is only a half-formed thought, but one of the contexts I was thinking about that might be useful to hear is not just Orientalism, or maybe Orientalism is a subset of the Jewish question, the question of secularization in the 19th and 20th century. And I was curious if you had thought about what the Sephardim meant to non-Jews, writing about Spanish history, what it meant to Jews also. I'm thinking about the debates between Greitz and Treschke, and the very question of whether the example of the Sephardim is one that should be embraced as a positive image, that it was actually the ghetto, or it was actually the community that saved Jews through this period. In some sense, that's the chauvinist story that you're invoking, or the sort of assimilationist story is the one that is privileged in this debate as well. So there are two valences of the story of the Sephardim that I think are interesting here as well. One that is leading to a modern Europe of assimilation, the other which is endurance over time and resistance to assimilation. And both seem to share the same nostalgia for the past.
Well, I think all modern communities share nostalgia for the past, and people, especially in the 20th century now or in the 21st, it's something very common in groups that were formed, see their formative period in the past. So I'm not sure about that, but in terms of what non-Jews, that's a different project. I mean, Ryan suggested that I limit it to 45 minutes. Yes.
Thank you so much for an interesting lecture. I know you didn't want to talk about this, but I'm really curious to hear your take on the offer of citizenship to Sephardic Jews in Spain and Portugal, and how you read that particular politics of belonging and the demarcating of Spain and Los Caminos de Sefarad. I'd love to know what you're thinking about that.
It's actually a fascinating topic, and it goes back to an interest among Spanish intellectuals in Sephardism when they were losing their control of their colonies in the post-1898 period. There was a sense of tremendous loss of prestige. And the idea of reaching out to Sephardim really comes from the early 20th century among these intellectuals. So it's not a new thing. This sense of pride that there were people all over the world who spoke, or not all over the world, but over a lot of the world who spoke sort of Castilian, and they should be welcomed back. And so the idea really has its roots long ago. What do I think about it? Most of the people who apply are doing it for completely, they want an EU passport. The Spaniards have not been generous about, the Portuguese have been much more generous about actually giving citizenship to Jews who can show Sephardi background. I think what I think about it doesn't really matter very much. I think I understand on both sides, but I do think the interests on both sides are quite different. There's, this is a way of, it's a form of expiation for Spain. They're just beginning to acknowledge. When I first visited Spain, there was a sign in the Santa Maria la Blanca synagogue in Torino saying that this building, once a synagogue, was consecrated by San Vicente Ferrer. that was, I was really taken aback. And there's been a change over time, and I think that's part of it. But I think from the side of Jews who are interested, it's purely, nobody wants to live in Spain unless you have particular commercial reasons to do so. It's not a particularly desirable place to live. So that's what I think.
In terms of the formation of what anyone might call some kind of Sephardic identity in the early modern period, how important were perceptions of non-Jews, non-Sephardim, let me ask it a different way. How important were suspicions that the Sephardim were not loyal to Judaism in terms of the formation of their own identity? In other words, was this kind of dialectical relationship between them and other Jews, criticizing them for being some sort of watered down Jews who were suspected of having converted to Christianity or still having Christian fealties?
Are you referring to the Portuguese Jews?
Portuguese, Spanish, just the wider phenomenon of these people, constantly crossing boundaries and raising suspicions on the part of Catholic authorities and of Jewish authorities. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, to a certain extent, did they forge an identity in reaction to suspicions about them? Is that operative at all, or?
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
A lot has been written about the Tshuva literature on rabbinic attitudes about conversos, and Netanyahu wrote a book that's quite controversial in that respect. I don't know how you would go about researching it.
Yeah.
I think probably it makes sense psychologically, but I don't know how you go about researching it.
I was wondering if there was using evidence of that kind of consciousness and anxiety as almost as they had to prove themselves in a certain kind of way.
Well, we can look. We can look at the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. On the one hand, they were incredibly proud of them. Had a very strong, well-cultivated sense of their own superiority over any other Jews, but certainly Tedescos. But on the other, yes, they recognized that they didn't have, and that's why they needed to turn to the Mediterranean Sephardim. But I think that was their way of dealing with it. And continuing to perhaps also may have played a part in their continuing contempt for Ashkenazim, even when the Ashkenazim became wealthier than they were and more numerous. Jeff?
Maybe just, today we live in the, age of identity politics where everything is based on identity. But I think, thinking to other eras in which identities are more fluid, where people may not identify themselves so clearly, in those terms. I wonder, the extent to which certainly European conceptions of Sephardim, the allure of the Sephardic that John Efron writes about. I wonder the extent to which that's political in a European context, looking at convivencia as an ideal more than the Sephardim themselves, but this ideal of living in harmony with each other, the ways of maintaining
the ornament of the world.
right, yeah, and the ways of maintaining oneself in surrounded by anti-Semitism. They're thinking of the Marranos as this ideal of of maintaining identity or maintaining religion more than identity, and how much the conceptions of Sephardim as it's conceived in the 19th century is a part of that kind of political reality more than identity construction.
I don't know how much it played a part in the 19th century. I think it plays a part today. The Menokal book, I think, is a good example of, this is an ideal way. If Jews would only open themselves up and love poetry and philosophy, that would contribute to, I think that's implicit in that point of view. It's not something I really thought about for this paper, but I do think that plays a role. Yes.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. First, a comment that Hakitiya was spoken also in Meknes and in Fez, not only in the northwest part of Morocco, but also we find in Meknes Shir HaShirim in Hakitiya in the 18th century. So it survived even into the 19th century. That's a comment. For me, the most interesting moment is when the Megurashim versus Toshavim, how they are defined in the responsa or the documents, or when a Moroccan Arabic-speaking Jew is in a few decades later, we find they are speakers of Castellano and not Azamiya, the speaker. So the moment of change, and for me, regarding the Romaniot Jews, it's also interesting that these non-Iberian Jews are also enchanted with the Sephardic identity, with Sephardic something about them, about their cultural capital is so attractive to them. It's not only about the sheer numbers of the Jews arriving, and they didn't only arrive from Castile. They are from Aragon, they are from Portugal, but something about, there was something going on there for me that marks a moment of emerging identity. For me, there is. And I think regarding the Romanio Jews, maybe a clue would be their intent to show some loyalty to the Sultan. Before, they were the remnant of the Byzantine Empire. After the fall of Constantinople, now they're allocated, they are in Istanbul. And if you want to be a good Jew, then maybe you better be a Sephardi, the Jew of Spain. So that's why many of them so quickly, already during the 16th century, they give up on speaking Greek and the Romaniot custom and switch into a new thing within, assimilating within the Sephardi.
It's interesting. My impression was that the Romaniot Jews, it was precisely in Istanbul where they maintained their own congregations.
There are remnants of Romaniot community. There was a Romaniot community that was the remnant of a once more established, but they were all relocated, like they were from Saloniki, allocated into Istanbul. So they didn't conserve their identity. Quite quickly, the last chief rabbi of the Romaniot community is in the 16th century. They assimilated into what we can call Sephardic. So for me, I would like to hear more how you see the disputes, first disputes we see between Romaniots and Sephardim in this responsa, but then so quickly adopting this.
To be just very frank, it's not an area of expertise for me at all, and I would love to see how that happened. I'm not quite sure where I have read about the Romaniot community in Istanbul, but certainly elsewhere, it's very clear elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, the Romaniot Jews were very quickly absorbed. And you say it may be a matter of cultural capital. It may very well be. But they were also outnumbered in many of those places. It was only in Istanbul where there was a concentration because of the, I don't know how to pronounce it, Sorgun?
Yeah.
that they weren't outnumbered by
And the final
the
thought, I think that language is a key factor. Well, I'm interested in those languages. And for me, adopting Castilian as the basis of their new identity, why not Portuguese? Why not Aragonese? Because within the Iberian Peninsula, Castilian was a emerging power, but now it already connected them to the New World. It was suddenly an empire. So the Jews and their Castilian, they came, it marked them with something special, and their image of a community now included both the image of Muslim Spain in a longer past and also of Christian Spain. Now that they were newly in a Muslim, again in a Muslim context, their idea of imagined community was both of that Christian last period and of the Andalusian past. This is thought.
Thank you. Moshe?
Yes, thank you very much. And I wanted to ask, okay, so if we limit ourselves, so Sephardim is not it's not global, it's Mediterranean. So we go back to the discussion of Mediterranean unity or interconnectedness. So if you're limited to the Mediterranean, can we still say, okay, these are all different, there are many differentiations between communities, but overall, even not merchants, but rabbis like Radbaz, like Chida and others, they're not all the same, but they're all traveling the same circle, and they're Cairo, Tzfat, Damascus, and
They're going where the money is.
What?
They're going where the money is. Right? I mean, they're going to
So can we still say, okay, so it's a circle, it's not the entire Sephardim, but the Mediterranean Sephardim are really, there is really something that connects them, or you say, no, there's not really.
Well, you know. The Vida went to Amsterdam. I think they really tried to travel to places where they knew they would be received and that they would be able to collect funds. The Mediterranean was convenient, but I don't know whether that.
But nothing more.
No, I mean, some of the emissaries were collecting money on behalf of all of the communities in Eretz Israel, not for a certain one. No, I think Matthias Lehmann makes a very compelling argument that this is a very ethnically, from an identitarian point of view, a very divided Mediterranean by the 18th century.
But once again, I'm sorry to bring up divisions again, but in the Mediterranean historiography, it's such a persistent theme, both unity and divisions, right? If you read the Corruption Sea, that's the whole point, the whole central argument of that book is that it's unified precisely because it's divided. So it's kind of this constant tension in the region that, again, it seems to me, I don't want to be a geographical determinist or anything like that, but the whole Mediterranean history has been about unity and division. So in a way, I don't see why it should be different with the exiles from Iberia.
I agree with you, and I'm interested. Mark Meyerson is working on a book on the Mediterranean, which will include all populations in the Mediterranean from 600 to 1600. Is that?
It's a textbook, Frankel.
It's a textbook, but it's conceptualized.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I do think that you might want to think about thinking about Mediterranean Jewry rather than a Sephardic diaspora.
So I would, this is really fascinating, and I'm very interested in I find it very compelling in the idea that we shouldn't speak of the Portuguese diaspora as being part of the same Sephardic diaspora that exists in the Mediterranean. By the time we get to the 19th and 20th century, though, there certainly is a sense of Sephardicness in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Ladino-speaking or Ladino-reading worlds that extends from Vienna down to Alexandria. And there's a circulation of people, there's a circulation of knowledge. And I think, to touch on Jeff's point, the divisions between what is Sephardic and what other communities one could belong to, there were the clear communities that you couldn't belong to if you were Sephardic. So you couldn't be both Sephardic and part of the Ashkenazi community in Istanbul, for example, or part of the separate Russian community in Istanbul.
Actually, in Istanbul, you could. I didn't quote it, but there's a ruling. There's a ruling. I believe it's in 1571.
Yeah, I'm speaking of the 19th and 20th centuries,
Okay.
so things are very
But I
different.
want to tell you that in 1571, if you were a Jew in Istanbul, you could belong to whatever congregation you wanted. It was a ruling of the community.
Right, okay, I will buy that, and, you know, it sounds plausible for the 16th century, but by the 19th century, things are different. But you could be, you know, you could slip very easily between Sephardi and belonging to the Sephardi Jewish community and Italian Jewish community. And the Italian Jewish community comes to exist in 1868 in Istanbul as a response to internal Sephardi politics and contention over the trajectory that Jewish education should take in Istanbul even prior to the arrival of the Alliance. And that's what leads to the creation of a separate Italian kehillah in Istanbul. But there was a lot of back and forth between members of the Sephardic community and members of the Italian kehillah. But there was a Sephardic community and there was an Italian. That slippage did exist on a practical level between families and individuals going back and forth. I think Sephardicness also comes to bear very importantly once the Ottoman Empire starts to disintegrate and Jewish communities throughout the Ottoman Balkans and the Arab provinces and elsewhere find themselves within these distinct nationalizing states that they don't fit into in a very adequate
This is actually something that I mentioned in the paper, that is a trigger.
Yeah,
for.
Okay, so I must have taken in my notes an incorrect timing, but it's the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and that provides them a model of cohesion.
Or a need for it.
A need for it.
Which I think gets back nicely to Jeff's point, which is that, living in the 21st century, you need to have an identity, something like that. I mean, so that's the feeling. But in most of human history, it was completely meaningless, and it was a much more transactional thing than the way we think about it. And I do think that in looking at, there are endless combinations and permutations. That it's important just to keep that in mind, that there is that dynamic of convergence and divergence and fluctuation over time that couldn't possibly deal with in a single article or not necessarily in a single book, which is why I'm really eager to see what Mark Meyerson comes up with in this volume.
It's for undergraduates,
No pressure.
Mark, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
There are people too.
Thank you for that comment. Yes.
Okay, last question, Shai, just because I want to.
So you mentioned this moment in the 70s with the Black Panthers, but I think that we should also keep in mind that there's an almost opposite kind of moment during the same time when the Sephardi Ben Gurion, Rav Ovadia Yosef, right, would actually do something very similar to the Sephardi chauvinism that we know from earlier times, right? He will subjugate all Mizrahi and Arabic traditions, Yemenite, Iraqi, Moroccan, to Yosef Karo, to an imagined kind of Sephardiness, and would kind of erase some of these traditions, very similarly to what Megorashim will do in the 15th and 16th century with the traditions of Algeria or other places. And so we also have this instinct.
Absolutely, it's a good point. I even thought about it for this paper, talking about that aspect of it, but I think you're absolutely right. Of course, power is part of what's going on there, but it is also a part of a more general recognition of Sephardiness. That is, he could only do it if the population he's turning to recognizes what he's saying and the value of what he's saying and can relate to it. But yes, absolutely. Okay.
Please join me